Thank you so much for braving the freezing cold to come here today to the Wilson Center. I'm Megan Parker. I'm the senior writer editor for the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. And the Wilson Center is thrilled to be hosting the Year Ahead in Environment and Energy with the Society of Environmental Journalists again for the 4th year in a row. And we're very glad that all the speakers and all of you could come back today after our first try at this got caught up in Snowzilla. So I really appreciate everyone for coming back at another bite at this. Our partnership with the Society of Environmental Journalists is very important to the Wilson Center, and especially to me as I'm the associate board member for SEJ right now. And I'd like to thank my colleagues on the SEJ board, many of whom are here today in the audience, for their support of this event, and as well as Executive Director Beth Park, who couldn't come back again now. And then also as well, I want to give a special thanks to former board president Carolyn Wetzel, who has been my partner in organizing this event now for 4 years, and who is busily organizing our annual conference in Sacramento, which will take place in September. And I know that Jeff will tell you a little bit more about. But first, a quick word about where you're sitting. The Wilson Center is the living formal memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who is the only president to have a PhD. And we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy, neutral forum for international affairs. We were just named last week the #1 transdisciplinary think tank in the world. And my program, the Environmental Change and Security Program, has long championed an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how the environment and natural resources are connected to our health, to our prosperity, and especially to our security. And you can learn more about that on our website, thenewsecuritybeat.org. Today's event will begin with a brief introduction to the Society of Environmental Journalists from Jeff Burnside, the current president of the board of directors. He'll introduce Jessica Coombs, who will give Bloomberg's 2006 environmental outlook. After that, Tim Wheeler and our all-star panel will take the stage for a lively roundtable discussion and Q&A with all of you. And then finally, after that, we'll move to the dining room for the reception. And on behalf of the Wilson Center, I'd like to take a moment to thank our reception supporters, many of whom are here today. The Nature Conservancy, whose mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends in more than 35 countries, all 50 states, and in your backyard. We're thrilled to welcome the Nature Conservancy team here today to the Wilson Center. The Environmental Law Institute makes law work for people, places, and the planet. And the Wilson Center is a frequent partner with ELI on issues of international environmental governance. Resource Media is one of a kind, a nonprofit communications firm 100% dedicated to working in support of communities, the environment, and public health. And check out their website, Women at the Center. Bloomberg BNA is a leading source of legal, tax, regulatory, and business information, including the annual environmental outlook that Jessica will tell you about. And thank you to my colleagues at the Wilson Center Science and Technology Innovation Program, who are doing groundbreaking work on cool stuff like synthetic biology, citizen science, and serious games. And now I'm pleased to introduce Jeff Burnside, the president of the board of Society of Environmental Journalists. He has been in the news business for more than 20 years as a reporter, anchor, news manager, and producer in Boston, Miami, and most recently Seattle as senior investigative reporter for Como 4 News. Jeff?
Thank you, Megan, very much. Thank you. On behalf of the nearly 1,300 members of the Society of Environmental Journalists, we are pleased to welcome you to this important panel where we are going to be hearing from journalists who are going to offer their insight based on their reporting of these very issues and what they see will be the coming headlines in the year 2016. And our reporters usually are conveying what other people are thinking. This time, though, you've got a sneak peek right there. This time, though, we're going to be hearing what they think. And we believe that that's why this auditorium is constantly packed with people who want to know what reporters think will be some of the headlines coming up in the coming year. And by the way, you'll have your chance to inject what you think should be some of the headlines when we open it up for questions, not speeches, but questions here in the auditorium and as well as via Twitter using the hashtag SEJDC. You can start sending the questions right now, by the way. Thank you, Megan Parker from Wilson Center and Carolyn Wetzel from Bloomberg BNA, who have every year made this really a world-class event. And we want to thank the United States Supreme Court, by the way, for making such great fodder yesterday for us to be dialoguing here today. We would love to have the justices up here on the stage to tell us what they're thinking. But instead, we're going to get a bunch of journalists to tell us what they think the justices are thinking. And as you may know, the blizzard of 2016 canceled our original date for this forum. We thought, as environmental journalists who cover extreme weather events and climate change, it'd be great to have a forum in the middle of all the historic blizzards. But of course, that now, as you see, we arrived when everyone else was leaving D.C. just ahead of the storm. We found out that the federal government didn't like the idea of staying open, so they shut down the city. The Wilson Center shut down. Everybody left town. We had the run of the town all by ourselves. And thank goodness that the Hamilton was open the entire time. So we were able to get food and sustenance. We had the keys, don't tell anybody, to the National Press Club. So we met there, and you see, we're actually going into the building there during the height of the blizzard, mind you, and we met for hours and hours on end doing SEJ business dutifully. And at one point, you see those glasses there. Well, we do have a history of... That picture was not supposed to be there, I apologize. But nevertheless, we all did sled down the Capitol Hill in the snow, and thank good none of the journalists got arrested in doing so. Actually, that would have been a great headline to start off the year with environmental journalists arrested for sledding down Capitol Hill. Better only if Senator Inhofe had been there with us, getting arrested, maybe along with the journalists. Now, as you may know, the Society of Environmental Journalists is the world's leading group of professional journalists, writers, reporters, authors, artists, photographers, filmmakers, students, and academics anywhere in the world. We cover these issues like no one else can. And if we invite you to join us, go to our webpage and see if you qualify for one of our membership categories at sej.org. If you haven't already been, you'll be amazed at our extraordinary annual conferences. I know some of you in the audience have been. This year it's in September in California, where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of journalists who cover issues of energy and the environment are all in one place at one time. That is an extraordinary opportunity and gathering. Imagine the bulk of journalists in North America who cover these issues under one roof. So if you have a stake in what reporters report, you need to have a presence at the SEJ annual conferences. The collective readership and viewership and listenership of our membership reaches daily well into the millions, perhaps tens of millions, around North America and around the world. So we invite you to learn a little bit more about the Society of Environmental Journalists. If you're a member, see if you qualify for one of our membership categories. If you believe in our mission of more environmental journalism, better environmental journalism, accurate environmental journalism, and then talk to us about being a financial supporter, because the planet as we know it is at stake. It is that important. And we believe in our mission of being good, professional, solid, honest journalists, and we want you to help us do that any day of the week. So go to our website, sej.org, to find out more. It's my pleasure to introduce Jessica Coombs, who is going to be giving us our opening remarks for today. Jessica is the Deputy News Director at Bloomberg BNA, overseeing coverage of climate change, air pollution, water pollution, energy, and natural resources. She has worked at Bloomberg BNA for 6 years and previously was a reporter for Congressional Quarterly, News House News Services, and the Arizona Republic. She is a graduate of Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. Please give a warm welcome to Jessica Coombs to start us off. Jessica.
Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. It's good to be here. So the Obama administration has really spent the past 7 years issuing policies to solidify its environmental legacy. But for the most part, that's done now. On the climate front, the EPA issued the first ever carbon pollution standards for power plants. That's done. On the air pollution front, the EPA issued mercury standards for power plants. It issued a regulation targeting emissions from the plants that cross state lines into downwind states. It issued an ozone rule that affects industries across the economy. That's all done. On the water rule, EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers issued a major regulation to determine the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. That's done. So what's left? Defending those rules. The Obama administration is going to spend the next year, its last year in power, trying to convince judges across the country that the work it's been doing over the past 7 years is legal, and President Obama's environmental legacy is in the balance. There's two big cases to watch, and I'll start off by talking about the Clean Power Plan litigation. Bad news for EPA this week. The case is being heard in a federal appeals court, but the Supreme Court stepped in and took the unprecedented step, the unexpected step, of putting the rule on hold while the case proceeds. The court didn't explain its reasoning, but it sends a signal. It's essentially like the Supreme Court is telling the EPA, hey, EPA, we think there might be major problems with this rule. And it sends a signal that this rule, when it gets to the Supreme Court, which everyone thinks it's going to get to the Supreme Court, it could be overturned. The Clean Power Plan is also the backbone of President Obama's international climate push. The U.S. and 200 other countries committed in Paris late last year to tackle climate change. The U.S. said it's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, and the Clean Power Plan is one of the major components of how it promised to do that. So the rest of the world is watching this case. So if the Clean Power Plan is overturned, could it derail the International Climate Pact? I think there's a lot of debate, and I think your panel is going to have some good discussion on that. But the litigation will go on. The case is being heard in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Briefing is going to happen throughout the spring. Oral arguments are scheduled for early June. The challengers in this case are a majority of states, which is significant, and also a variety of industries. The key legal issue here is what the Clean Air Act allows. When Congress amended the Clean Air Act in 1990, the House and Senate adopted differing amendments with conflicting language, and when the bill was signed into law, that was never fully resolved. So the question is, can the EPA regulate carbon emissions under one section of the Clean Air Act when mercury emissions from power plants are already regulated under a different section? The House amendment says no, the Senate amendment says yes. I also should mention that the Clean Power Plan is regulates existing power plants. There is a related regulation targeting new emissions from newly built power plants, if there were going to be any newly built coal-fired power plants. That regulation is important because the Clean Power Plan, the legal footing for the Clean Power Plan, is predicated on having a legal rule for newly built power plants. So that litigation is also ongoing. It's moving on a slower track than the Clean Power Plan litigation, but it's worth paying attention to this year also. So the other major rule that's being litigated in court this year that the Obama administration is going to have to defend, it's called the Waters of the U.S. Rule. People call it WOTUS. The EPA has started calling it the Clean Water Rule. So the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers in June issued this regulation to determine which waters and wetlands are subject to Clean Water Act jurisdiction. The key issue here is that this rule could increase permitting costs if you have a project that needs a Clean Water Act permit. So lawsuits have been filed across the country in federal district court and federal appellate court, and what's happening right now is they're figuring out which court is going to hear this case. The Sixth Circuit has stayed the rule while litigation is ongoing. Also, it's significant here, another majority of states, 32 states, don't like the Clean Water Rule. Home builders, farmers, miners are among the industry that are also suing over it. But there's more. EPA is going to be in court this year defending the ozone, National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We're expecting a ruling on the legality of the air pollution standards for industrial boilers and incinerators. The Supreme Court has a water case. The Army Corps of Engineers is defending a jurisdictional determination for wetlands. The issue here is SCOTUS is going to determine whether is going to make a determination whether one of these determinations is final agency action, which is just significant because you can sue over final agency action. Other regulations that the EPA has to defend: a rule exempting water transfers from permit requirements, a rule regulating the management and disposal of coal ash, which is the residue from coal-fired power plants, a definition of what exactly is solid waste. And the Farm Bureau is backed by 22 more states challenging the EPA's plan to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. So moving on to Capitol Hill this year. TSCA reform, the Toxic Substances Control Act, the nation's primary chemicals law. There's been a movement to modernize this law, to reform this law. The House and Senate have each passed their own versions of this bill. And right now they're working at the staff level on the Hill to try to negotiate a compromise that they can send to the president. They're trying to wrap this up by the spring. We'll see if they can do it. If it slips past the spring, we're getting into presidential election territory, so there's questions on whether this is realistic for 2016. A couple of points. The Senate bill would describe it as more of an overhaul of the statute. Democrats seem to like this one a little bit better because it gives more flexibility to the states. The House version is more targeted, it's more narrow in focus, and it's seen as more industry-friendly. This would be the first update to TSCA since 1976, and if it is enacted, it would make for a busy 3 years for the EPA, which is going to have to issue policies and guidance and regulations to implement a new law. Also on Capitol Hill, we're going to see a lot of oversight of EPA and environmental policies, like we do every year. Like Paris, the International Climate Agreement from December, Republicans, we're hearing, could introduce a sense of the Senate that says that the Obama administration, by agreeing to an international pact based on executive branch authority, skirts the Senate's role to advise and consent on international agreements. On social media, the Government Accountability Office had released a report that the APA violated law on grassroots lobbying when it promoted the Waters of the U.S. rule on Twitter. We see interest from Republicans and other lawmakers from coal states who don't like the Clean Power Plan. And Flint, Michigan. This has been a big story over the past year. Lead from the water pipes in Flint has leached into the drinking water. Investigators have found elevated levels of blood in the city's children, and we'll see interest from lawmakers on what the EPA's role was in that crisis. And also the Gold King mine. This happened last summer. EPA accidentally caused the release of 3 million gallons of mining waste into a river in Colorado. So all that said, EPA does have some policy work to continue on this year. On climate, the biggie is we're going to see methane standards for new oil and gas operations. We should see that this summer. It only applies to new oil and gas operations. We'll see enviros who are pushing the EPA to also regulate emissions from existing sources. Methane limits from solid waste landfills, carbon limits and fuel efficiency standards for trucks. A finding that aircraft emissions endanger our health and the environment. This is the first step at a regulation, so an actual rule, if the finding is made, would be bumped to the next administration. And it's worth noting that aircraft are the largest unregulated source of greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector that's left. And drinking water, the lead and copper rule. I bring this up because this has renewed focus after the Flint water crisis. This rule that EPA is working on targets the metals, the lead and copper that's leached from the plumbing into people's drinking water. And air pollution, the mercury and air toxic standards for power plants. The EPA is working to address a Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court said that EPA needs to go back and work on this rule and show that it's appropriate and necessary to regulate mercury from power plants. It's worth noting in this case that while the litigation went on, most power plants either installed pollution controls or decided to close to comply with the rule. This was the rule that was supposed to cost $9.6 billion a year for industry. So there is some speculation that EPA may have bragged about this mass compliance before litigation was completed, and there's speculation that could have influenced the Supreme Court's decision on the Clean Power Plan this week. On the air office is also working on an exceptional events rule. So this is where things like wildfires and volcanoes, these are events that cause unexpected and lots of air pollution. So this rule would exclude for these events from consideration when deciding if an area is meeting national ambient air quality standards. We'll expect that rule in August. And on Superfund, so this year we're going to see a rule to incorporate vapor intrusion into the EPA's system that it uses to determine sites on the national priorities list, which is the list of the most contaminated Superfund sites. Vapor intrusion is a health risk. This is when volatile organic compounds migrate from groundwater and soil into buildings. A rule that I'll mention on the water pollution front, we'll see final rules in November addressing stormwater runoff. Stormwater runoff is one of the most significant sources of water pollution. Metals, trash, motor oil, sewage end up in rivers and lakes. And one last note on the regulatory front on chemicals. We're seeing EPA prepare for TSCA reform with its work plan chemical assessment program. EPA is doing chemical prioritization, risk assessment, risk management, and this is going to go forward whether or not Congress moves forward with TSCA reform. I'll move to talk about energy for a little bit. The energy bill is being debated in the Senate. It's being held up right now over a dispute between Republicans and Democrats over funding for the Flint water crisis. The parties are negotiating right now on a compromise. But this underlying bill would expedite federal approvals for liquefied natural gas exports. It would increase cybersecurity for the electricity grid, and would expedite licensing processes for hydropower plants. And the last major energy bill was enacted in 2007. On regulation in the energy world, DOE is, the Department of Energy is releasing efficiency standards for residential gas furnaces this year. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is developing nuclear plant safety strategies in response to the Fukushima disaster. And Interior's Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, which is the agency that regulates aspects of offshore oil and gas exploration and production, has a couple of rules of interest this year. It's planning to strengthen the standards for well control during exploratory drilling. This is the rule that came out of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. It's called the Blowout Preventer Rule. And this same agency has another kind of interesting rule, Arctic drilling rule for offshore oil and gas exploration. The criticism here is that it would make the drilling season in the Arctic too short to make it worthwhile. One more interior rule, the Interior Stream Protection Rule, which affects mining. We'll see updates to requirements for limiting generation of coal mining waste and where that waste can be placed. I'll talk a little bit about endangered species and our favorite bird, the greater sage-grouse. So federal plans for protecting this bird are going to be implemented this year. These plans are going to block oil and gas drilling and mines in the prime sagebrush habitat. This habitat encompasses millions of acres. These birds live in 11 states. This will also affect road building, electricity transmission lines, ranching, farming, new housing. A couple of notable energy cases we're following this year. Interior is defending a Bureau of Land Management rule regulating fracking on federal lands. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration is defending its crude by rail rule. This is the rule that sets speed restrictions and standards for tank cars, safety standards. There's a lot of public scrutiny on this rule after a couple of high-profile train derailments that not only killed people but caused severe environmental damage. And one case that could affect FERC is at our Supreme Court. This case could delineate federal and state power in energy markets, and we're hearing oral arguments this month. I have a grab bag of other environmental issues also. So international climate. We went to Paris in December. We signed on with 200 countries for the first time to a global accord to tackle climate change for developed and developing countries alike. But the details of that agreement are going to be worked out in November in Morocco. For example, how do you verify that countries are going to do what they say they're going to do? How do you build on efforts to prepare vulnerable countries for things like rising sea levels? And I'll mention something about environmental enforcement this year at EPA, the Next Generation Compliance Program. EPA has described this as the new normal. Components of Next Gen we're seeing in settlements, legal settlements, requiring industry to operate advanced monitoring systems, to do electronic reporting and data analytics to ensure compliance. EPA thinks that this is an important program when budgets keep getting smaller and smaller. The Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance budget has dropped 9% at EPA over the past 5 years. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have a presidential election this year. Frontrunner Hillary Clinton, she's getting pushed more and more to the left on environmental issues. She's praised the climate deal. She's come out against Keystone. She has talked about ramping down drilling on public lands. She and Bernie Sanders want to make climate a wedge issue for voters in the general election. And they're both elevating environmental justice issues on the campaign. They talk about the Flint water crisis. They're going to debate in Flint. On the Republican side, environment and climate issues are an unsettled issue there. Republicans haven't been pressed to solidify their positions, and the Republican candidates are not pushing climate plans of their own at this point. And advocates are pushing the GOP, whoever the GOP nominee is, to come up with a plan on climate during the general election. So it's going to be a busy year for all of us who are paying attention to environmental and energy policy issues in the coming year. Come find me on Twitter. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a wonderful overview. Much food for thought for our panelists, who I'll now invite to come up to the stage. And while they're coming up here and getting seated, I'll just tell you a little bit about Tim Wheeler, who's going to be moderating our panel. So Tim is the managing editor and project writer for the Chesapeake Bay Journal, a nonprofit news organization covering the nation's largest estuary. He's a former president of the Society of Environmental Journalists and has won numerous awards for his coverage. And for more than 30 years, he was an environmental reporter and editor at the Baltimore Sun, where he also covered growth and development, state and local development, and higher education. So Tim will introduce the panelists. You all also have bios, they're complete bios, so you can look at those for more information, and then lead a roundtable discussion with them and then with all of you. So, Tim?
Thank you, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to see a nice crowd here. We hope we can make this as lively as possible and give you lots of insights and some really good, valid predictions. Obviously, our track record isn't terribly good since we planned this event on the day of a major blizzard that knocked things out before. But hopefully we'll be a little bit more on point, or at least shy away from those kinds of predictions. Panelists, we don't really have much to talk about. Jessica's pretty well covered it all, hasn't she? We can all go home or go straight for the reception at this point. But no, we have to put in a little effort anyway, and there was a lot of things to talk about there. I guess the question is, what are the ones that maybe weren't on that list, or which ones on those lists deserve closer scrutiny? To my immediate left, Laura Barron-Lopez, reporter with Huffington Post. What would you say are the most important things here? You cover Congress primarily, is that right?
Yes, generally. I used to be an energy and environment reporter for The Hill, and I still dabble in it here and there. When it comes to the Congress, I would actually say that you shouldn't expect them to do too much given the shortened calendar year because of the election. They have a really long summer break, and they are also out for all of October. So unless it happens before spring, as Jessica mentioned, the chances of anything happening, whether it's TSCA reform or even this energy bill right now, which may go down in flames due to Democrats trying to get some aid for Flint, the likelihood of something substantial happening in Congress is pretty slim.
Now, there were a couple of sort of examples of bipartisan agreement at the end of 2015, which were a little bit surprising. Do you not expect that kind of comedy to carry over into an election season?
Given the fact that the animosity is somewhat carrying over from the election, from the campaign trail into Congress a little bit, I'm not sure that that will happen. If you do see anything, it could be in the appropriations bills, or which end up actually might be another omnibus might actually be happening as opposed to the 12 appropriations bills passing as Republicans want. And so that's where certain things may seep in, like you did see at the end of 2015 with the wind and solar PTC extensions and the lifting of the crude oil export ban.
And a ban on microbeads, which we all care about in the water pollution world. One area that wasn't covered so much, and it is kind of terribly important, is the whole budget appropriations thing. What can we expect to see there?
Right now, I guess you can expect to see, given what Jessica was saying, there is going to be a push on trying to rein in, the EPA, which has been something that Republicans have done in the past. So where they'll see opportunities within the appropriations process to possibly try to, scale back what EPA is able to do, what Interior is able to do, what DOE is able to do on certain, with certain money pots that may be helping them push through these regulations that Republicans aren't in line with. So I think those are some of the areas that you have to look out for.
Okay, thank you. Our next panelist, Marla Cohn. If I get my bio out here, is senior editor for the environment for National Geographic. Marla, this is a panel that is in Washington. It's a lot of Washington-centered reporters. You happen to be in Washington too, but National Geographic takes a somewhat broader view of things too. Tell us what kinds of things we could be expected to happen or deserve coverage this year around the world.
Well, I think I'll be the outlier here, and no surprise. Those who know me, I've spent a career doing that as an environmental journalist. Most of my career has been spent in California, and we sort of go our own way when it comes to the environment, and no inside the Beltway type coverage for me. So I think this panel is about what will be the big stories, but for me it's more like I should be talking about what should be the big stories, because we had, I think, 6,000 journalists in Paris for the climate talks. We have thousands of stories about Flint. I think there were an estimated 10,000 stories coming out of the Paris climate talks, thousands of stories about the end of coal, tens of thousands of stories about fracking. What else should we be doing? I mean, is this a wise use of resources when newsrooms are so stretched thin to have everybody pretty much chasing the same stories? What I suggest is to looking for of course we have to cover the Clean Power Plan and the ozone standard and those types of, that's very important for us to cover. But what I want to do, and what I urge my reporters to do, is to look for the uncovered and the undercovered stories. Nothing is really new in the environment. Those of us who have been doing it for decades, it's the new twist that you put on the story. And that's what, especially at Nat Geo, what we're looking for. One area that I think is way undercovered is what's happening with the oceans. You could spend your whole career writing about what's happening with the oceans and never run out of stories. I think worker health is another undercovered area. You have some Center for Public Integrity has done some terrific stuff on the health of workers, and very few other people are covering that topic. We need more coverage of pesticides, especially in the developing world, environmental justice issues and indigenous people. Let's pay more attention to what's happening with diesel vehicles now. Volkswagen got a lot of attention to what was happening, but the coverage has sort of fallen off, and I'm thinking there's a lot of health issues, investigative issues that can revolve around that.
Okay, that's something to think about to start with. Chris Mooney, you write about energy and the environment for the Washington Post. You wrote some of those 10,000 articles about Paris, didn't you?
Yeah.
How do you account for
probably 20
yourself?
of them.
What do you think are the issues that we need to be paying attention to here?
Well, I actually can go in a little bit of a different direction because I guess I'm
Why not?
a science writer covering the environment and not always covering every regulation or everything that Congress does or doesn't do. So I actually think I don't know what I'm going to be looking at, but some things I think I might be looking at. 2016's heat, will it beat 2015, and what will be the sort of surprises we see from just how hot 2015 was and how hot 2016 will be? I think that we will see some things happen in the system. I don't know exactly what they'll be, but I think that they might be pretty interesting to cover and jump upon.
We've had a couple of weather extremes already in the past.
Right.
several
So,
months.
yeah, I wrote today about how Hurricane Patricia last year might have been the strongest hurricane for winds that the world's ever seen, recorded. That's the key word. And so I think it's really going to be interesting to see how the planet responds to the heat that's happening now. And I think that's something I'll be watching. We didn't talk enough about, this is in effect a way of telling the clean power plant story. If it's halted now, then I think the real story is, and this has been the real story for a while, but it's even more so now, is how fast can clean energy grow just based upon the policies we already have. And that's something you have to keep watching. How fast can the enabling technologies grow? How fast can batteries and storage grow? Right now, it looks like it's ahead of what the poor clean power plan predicted would happen. So there's sort of a race between without regulation and regulation right now.
And those are those are separate programs, separate from the clean power plant itself, right?
Or no programs at all. Right? But there are, of course, various subsidies that help wind and solar, and those were just renewed. So I'm really interested in watching the rate of installation and the spread of the industry. I think that's really important. I will be covering oceans, I promise. That's where some of the interesting surprises might be. Something we also didn't touch on is the new technologies that basically Paris requires or strongly implies. Because if you talk to scientists, they will tell you that basically the math of Paris essentially means that you have to be able to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's basically that simple. So that becomes now an important story. Where is carbon capture and storage? Is it? I mean, it's making some progress, but I think a lot of scientists would say not enough in light of what we just told you about the math. So I think that's something that's getting to be pretty important. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, that's a little bit of a setup here. Our next panelist, Manuel Quinones, with E&E. Let me turn my page here. And you cover primarily fossil fuels, energy, coal, which we don't hear much about these days except in the context of the clean power plant.
Right.
What is coal is not exactly thriving these days either, is it? Tell us what's the news to watch in terms of from the coal fields.
Well, it looks like many outlets have come a little bit late, I would say, to the coal story. The story under the Obama administration goes back to the very beginning of the administration. They came in with a lot of ideas on reforming coal and mining issues. So we started seeing a lot of action against mountaintop removal mining, at least cracking down a lot more on that. And then at the same time, on the western side, there was a lot of coal leasing going on. So there was talk of kind of a regional difference when it came to that. So then we move on a little bit more. There were some court losses when it comes to the mountaintop mining issues, a lot of political backlash in Appalachia that we're still seeing, and the administration retreated a little bit. But then we saw the re-election of the president. Those court losses turned into court victories for some in-the-weeds actions, but that are important when it comes to mining oversight. So now we're seeing the administration move forward even more muscularly.
Who's winning the war on coal at this point?
Perhaps, yeah. You're seeing maybe EPA is not going to do a lot more on mining than it already has, but we have the Interior Department Stream Protection Rule, and then we have a big surprise for people who follow this is the moratorium on new coal leases. When I started covering coal leases, the environmentalists wanted to stop them, wanted to reform the way the system was going for leasing federal coal, and it just seemed like it wouldn't happen. They started winning in court, and now the administration has actually enacted a moratorium. What is more broadly? What does that say more broadly? Is that now that feeds into the keep it in the ground movement. At first, several years ago, the whole keep it in the ground seemed like just a Pollyannish aspiration by a lot of environmental groups. Well, now we have the administration actually moving at least somewhat in that direction, and some of the presidential candidates, including Hillary Clinton, nodding to that. So there's been a lot of movement in the past several years, and the question is, how much more is the administration going to move in these last few months? Not to talk too much, but for example, the recently proposed $10 fee per barrel on oil shows that the administration seems to be willing to put forth a lot more. So what are they going to do with the months they have left over? And yeah, most major rules are out the door or almost out the door, and in the part where the administration's defending them in court. But there's a list of other actions that are still pending, and it's yet to be seen how muscularly the administration will move on those. Stream protection rule being one that's close to my beat.
Some of that pressure on the industry is basically economic as well as political and regulatory, is it not?
Oh yeah, and several years ago the argument was, is it the markets or is it the Obama administration? And there was, kind of both sides were arguing at each other as to who was really killing coal. And I think now the fact is that it's a little bit of both. But even if you take a lot of these regulations out of the equation, the market pressures are extremely tough on coal. A lot of us are doing stories about how the Clean Power Plan getting stayed by the Supreme Court is going to affect mining. And a lot of the coal miners were like, woohoo, this is exactly what we wanted. But they may not get, a lot of relief because the utilities are already making the changes. Natural gas, renewables are getting, cheaper by the day. So, yeah, market pressures are definitely going to help the Obama administration meet a lot of its goals, even without the rules.
Okay, thanks. Dean Scott, Bloomberg's BNA's senior climate change reporter. You were in Paris?
I was, sir.
Okay. And you wrote some of those 10,000 stories
I
as well.
wrote only 5,000 of them.
Only 5,000. And they never repeat a single thing.
And everyone read them with great interest, I would add.
So what is left to report about climate change? Haven't we solved it all now?
Well, so
with the exception of the Clean Power Plan.
We've always gone to these climate summits, and I always like to say we don't cover the meetings. We cover climate change and we cover the policies, right? So I think the thing that I'm interested going forward now is we have some coverage we'll be doing on Marrakesh because a lot of what was decided in Paris has to be implemented, and there's some things that we can't forget about. Implementation of, how as Jessica was talking about earlier, measuring the actual emissions of these countries is pretty central to seeing what kind of progress is making. And I won't go on at length about this, but I do think that there's a couple things to not sort of take for granted in terms of what was decided in Paris. One is just what countries have to do this sort of in-depth reporting. Mm-hmm. There's no list in the agreement. And there's a great question, for example, as to whether India is in the group of countries that will have to do the more detailed reporting. So you have to have the ideas under the agreement. They didn't create a list of countries that do or do not. So we'll be looking for that. Is there going to be a definitive sort of statement by countries we're in? We consider ourselves able to provide the kind of detail that people need to verify that we're cutting emissions. And I would be looking for some backsliding. That's why when you have international agreements, the very next year you have negotiators sitting at the table saying, we didn't agree to that. Not that. So I fully expect there will be news reports of countries saying, yes, we agreed in principle to the following provisions, but our understanding at the time was it meant this. And there will be a report, does this mean that we're going backward on climate? I would look for that story. The big story for international climate that I'm looking at is what do we do next? So, about midway through the Bush administration, I started going to the COP meetings for Bloomberg BNA. So the question was, can we get a global deal, right? And so then we get to Copenhagen, and there's a big mess. That I would just say, as an aside, looking back, a lot of the things that are in the Paris Agreement all date back to Copenhagen. So we might get to a point where we start to regard that summit as sort of the underrated climate summit. The $100 billion climate fund comes from that agreement. The idea of developing nations first putting pledges on the table for what they're going to do about emissions dates from Copenhagen. You can go down the list of this agreement. It's all outlined in the disaster that Copenhagen was. So from disaster, it can come great things, I suppose some would say.
So you're trying to revise history here and call
I would
that a
like to
success
revise a little
now.
history, sure.
1.5C
We're
was
going to look
was
back
there,
as well as
wasn't it?
forward
right,
here today,
yeah,
folks.
that's right.
Yeah.
A little revisionism can be a good thing. But I think the big thing that I'm interested in going forward is, so where do we go on climate change? All this energy, particularly since Copenhagen, has been about, can we get a global deal? Can we get the U.S. to the table? People forget just how long it took and how many years the U.S. sat around a table and was basically yelled at for not participating even in international negotiations. So we have a deal, but a lot of environmental groups, politicians, negotiators, they've been invested in getting a deal, right? So you have the deal, but what about climate change? And so my thinking is this is a great time for everyone to take a step back, probably in the policy arena, and start thinking about what's not in the agreement. And I'll give you just a couple of thoughts of my own. There are issues that, because of the complexities and the politics of negotiating a deal, sort of were off the table. One is adaptation in the bigger context. So as this $100 billion goes to developing countries, it's not all for adaptation. It's to help them also pursue low carbon development. So what are we doing about adaptation globally and in developed countries? So the U.S. has adaptation challenges, presumably. What is our approach here? The president has a program, but no one, I think, in this room would think that goes far enough to start planning on what's coming. So I think there's an interesting sort of dichotomy between this focus on what we can sort of do to make sure developing nations are made whole, or at least compensate them to some degree, help them prepare. There might be more attention to what developed countries are doing themselves and to protect their own populations. We have obviously disadvantaged populations in developed countries, so and low-lying areas, particularly in this country, and some other areas that I think deserve some more thought. Have to do with things that no one talks about in the context of Paris agreements, simple things like land use planning, simple things about where are we putting all this infrastructure. For the next 100 years, this country, for example, will have to build new bridges and transit. There's a new airport that's going into metropolitan New York. It's going to be rebuilt. There's not a tremendous amount of attention being given to the impacts of rising sea level on that project. There's a lot to be said about the lack of sort of integrated, thoughtful planning of where we're putting things for the next 100 years. And in this country, we're very much, as somebody who covered local land use, in the very beginning when I started, you have to start covering zoning meetings. It's all there, right?
Oh my God,
So
back to the future.
You got to start with zoning. A zoning board meeting will get you right at the heart of local planning and why we build things and put things where they are. So I think those are a couple things. And the only thing I would add to that is we haven't talked a lot about the election, the presidential election. And I would say this is very interesting. We talk about climate change and how little climate is looked at in the context of, by the voters, how high it is as a primary issue for people. This will be about the biggest distinction between two candidates of two parties on the climate issue that we've seen in this country when we're done, no matter who is the nominee for either party. And so I don't know that we've ever had those candidates so far apart on this issue. And I think that it's going to be really interesting for those of us who watch developments on Capitol Hill and how this agreement is sold or is fought over in the coming months, because the coattail effect that we were all taught about in college from presidential elections still exists to some degree. And so, whether, no one's really talking about this yet, but whether the Senate remains in Republican control has a lot to do with whether the Democratic nominee is president. And if they are, it's probably a toss-up, and might even be to the advantage of Democrats if the Democratic nominee wins.
Okay. Well, we'll pick over politics a bit more here in a minute. Your mention of infrastructure is a good segue to Matt Weiser, contributing editor with waterdeeply.org. Infrastructure is a big issue when it comes to water. We've learned the hard way through Flint. This is a story that I don't think anybody mentioned at the last forum in January of 2015 as being a big news story. Certainly didn't mention Flint, but we've suddenly been brought around and reminded of how important it is to take care of that infrastructure and to have the proper oversight of those folks taking care of it. Have we not, Matt?
We have, yeah. And Flint's a good example. And I guess I approach these things a little bit as Marla does. I've spent my career in California covering environment and water issues on the ground. And one of the things I've learned is you can talk all you want about new laws and regulations, but you have to be able to enforce them and monitor them. And I think that seems to be what went wrong in Flint. And I'm anxious to hear how that's going to be resolved in terms of figuring out what went wrong there. In California with the drought, there are some enormous infrastructure issues that have arisen because of water shortages, and the state is in the middle of sorting those out now. And despite what you may have heard, the drought is still underway in the world's eighth largest economy. You've probably seen a lot of headlines about how there's been pretty good storms so far this winter. There's snow in the Sierra. Everyone's happy about that, and everyone's grateful to El Nino. But in fact, this month El Nino has completely petered out. It's been dry all month. It's forecasted to be dry the whole rest of the month. So now everyone's asking, where's El Nino? And the speculation is that this El Nino is so strong that it's actually pushing the jet stream too far north, and all the storms are going past California. It could change come April. They're predicting that as it slacks off a little bit, the storms will come back to California. But for now, the outlook is not good. And again, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure, new dams, modifying existing dams, doing groundwater recharge. You may have seen the headlines today about Senator Feinstein's latest attempt at a water bill to throw money at infrastructure for California, to circumvent environmental laws, to get more water to farmers. I'd say the prospects for that bill aren't good because it's too much like her last attempt. But one of the things that, in terms of the theme of enforcing regulations, one of the things that's going to play out in California over the next year, I believe, is actually bringing into play a bunch of new laws that have been passed during the drought, one of which, and this has always been kind of interesting to me, California is always held up as an environmental leader in the world. But one arena where it's always been behind is in managing water. Its laws and regulations around water are behind the curve compared to most other American states, particularly groundwater. The state has never regulated groundwater, but last year, or rather in 2014, there was a new law, state law passed requiring groundwater to be measured and tracked and to be managed in a sustainable way. And so over the next 18 months, there's this whole new system of sustainable groundwater management agencies that are going to be formed throughout the state to decide what does sustainable mean for each of these regions and how to get there.
So this is going to be the next wave of water management, is dealing with groundwater?
Right. And it may be too little too late, but there really aren't any good prospects for new dams in California, so groundwater is the place everyone's looking for water for the future. So the state is now getting serious about managing its groundwater. The problem with that law is that it doesn't come into full force for 15 years. So
Well, the drought will be over by then.
hopefully, but maybe the next one will come along before then. So they basically have 15 years to take all the groundwater they want before it has to be sustainable. So that brings some obvious problems. Another way that the state is behind the curve compared to many other states is in managing its surface water. Believe it or not, there has never been a rule that requires people with water rights to monitor their diversions in real time. They only have to file reports every 3 years with the state, and often these are paper reports that someone puts in the mail saying, this is how much I diverted. And those are never followed up on by the state to verify if they actually diverted that or if they diverted 10 times more or whatever. But there's another new law that takes effect this year that requires diverters to install a gauge on their point of diversion and report actual measurements from that gauge to the state so that there's going to be some solid measuring of diversions. It won't be in real time. Probably still no one will follow up and check because the entire state of California only has 32 people to investigate water diversions. And they're all up to their eyeballs in work because of the drought. So I think it'll be interesting to watch that law evolve and see what those reports reveal and find out if anyone's following up on that.
Thanks, Matt. It sounds like, from what you're saying, and I think I picked this theme up with some of the other panelists as well, there's a lot of action, a lot of things happening outside of the Beltway in the states, and the states are taking the lead and having to be at the cutting edge in some of the environmental and energy issues that we have to deal with. Obviously, there's a federal role, and sometimes, as in Flint, that requires a federal oversight and not just coming in and shooting the wounded after the fact. And it sounds like, from what some of you are talking about, what's really called for from journalists anyway, is a lot of accountability and watchdog reporting down the road, in addition to covering the politics and the regulations and the court cases. Speaking again, though, of politics for just a second, let me just ask this one question of you, or about about what could happen out on Capitol Hill. There was a lot of talk about doing things to stop the Clean Power Plan on Capitol Hill. A lot of talk about stopping the Obama administration, with courts doing what the Supreme Court just did. Does that take the steam out of even that in terms of what Congress may do?
Sorry, you're asking if Congress is going to be doing anything on trying to push back against the carbon rule? Or
Yeah, at this point, since it's on hold.
I think that they're still going to try to, whether it's taking sense of the Senate votes or push back where they can, also in the appropriations process, like I mentioned before. But a lot of that, as I'm sure everyone knows, is going to be, if it does make it into certain bills, will then be vetoed by the president. It's not something that I think they realize now. Even McConnell has admitted, if we want to get things done or really push back on any of the regulations that they have put forward, whether it's WOTUS or whether it's the carbon rule, that isn't going to be happening until we get a Republican in the White House. So I think, though, that they are very happy about what happened with SCOTUS. That definitely is giving them some wind, especially since, yes, well, it doesn't mean that the rule will ultimately be struck down. It definitely isn't a good sign. And so I think that they'll just continue on their messaging as best they can. with different political votes that they can have on the floor to try and still keep attention on these regulations that they aren't in favor of.
More of the tennis match, back and forth. I see. So panelists, I guess the question here is you've heard from each other about what everyone thinks are the important issues, the unheralded issues, and the things to watch for in the future. Anything that anybody is prompted to come up with as a result of that? Did it generate any ideas in your head? Well, let me ask you this. We went all the way through this and talked about energy. Nobody ever talked about what the oil prices are going to be. So who cares to guess at that? That's always a popular topic in these year-end things. Of course, we only have 10 months to worry about now. We've got the easy job here. Oil prices are what, around $30 a barrel right now?
27.
They were lower than that,
27,
yeah.
all right. Who among you predicted that they would be that low at the start of 2016? Okay. Where are they headed? Are they going to stay there? Or are they going to go up?
All I can tell you is what the people who do this are forecasting.
What do they say?
Well, I think that nobody knows where the bottom actually is. But in general, by the end of the year, most people are still saying somewhat higher, but it's sort of not that much higher at this point. You hear that a lot.
Okay.
That's the best I can give you.
Yeah,
That's sort of the IEA, EIA kinds of forecasts, what they say.
Those are the sober people that we reporters tend to follow. I will tell you, in preparing for this, that was one of those questions I thought might come up, so I looked it up and I found forecasts as high as $70 or even $100
Really?
a barrel. Yeah, from outfits I've never heard
For
of.
the end
so-
of this year.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. The ones I've been seeing haven't been that high lately.
So, but they project, I guess, big, geopolitical changes in oil production out there. Perhaps the entire Middle East shutting down either because of conflict or OPEC suddenly discovering that it wants to control the market again somehow by cutting it off. Let's talk about politics for a minute. You mentioned, panelists, that, Dean, I guess there's a huge, and it was Jessica pointed out, the poll, there's a huge sort of divide between the Democratic and the Republican candidates here. Is this going to matter in the election at all?
I don't. I think I read the same polls probably everybody does in this room for elections and the degree to which climate change ranks as a top issue. I think where it might is because they in my view would be so far apart. It's a great way to draw contrast, right? Because you can have your bullet points, and you can talk about war on coal and slogans in presidential debates. But when they quote where you stand on climate change, one candidate's probably, in this case, in the upcoming election, is going to be saying that there are serious concerns about the science around climate change, and the other candidate is not. And that's not what Romney was saying. It's certainly not what Senator McCain was saying, who was a champion on this issue for a long time.
He did kind of weasel on it a bit when he became a presidential contender, did he?
Well, I don't know that he backed off. I think if you looked at his platform, he was there, but to the degree he emphasized it, and certainly in his base, that was not a place to go. But I do think this will be a really interesting year in that it's been a long time watching presidential elections to where